In this video, I want to talk about the topic of less is more. Now, when you're modeling components, there are obviously a lot of things that go into whatever you're designing. If it's an electronic housing, there is information inside. There's circuit boards, there's switches, there's components, there's lights, and so on. It's important to model as much as you can or as much as you need for designing your product. And a lot of times when you go into that render stage, especially if you're designing a product that has multiple components that maybe you're off the shelf and you have basic dimensions for and you're not modeling them, those components that are left out can make a difference in that final render. For something like a car body design, you can see that there is a lot of information missing. This is a hollow shell, there's nothing inside. If we were to render this, especially with the taillights having an illumination on them, you would see those from the inside of the car. There's no motor, we can see straight through to the back. There's no radiator, there's no transmission, there's nothing inside of this car. So it's important when you design components that you model as much as you need, as much as you can. And when you get to the render stage, you add in additional components if needed, or you figure out ways that you can block them or mimic them. For instance, with the headlights, these are just facades here. They're a clear glass lens that signify where the headlight would be. Now, if we show the lights that I have in the scene, we have some directional spotlights. So we have lights that are oriented behind the glass and shining forward as if the car had actual headlights. So if we zoom out, you can see that we have two headlights. They're in the same location, the same height, the same orientation, all the same settings. We also have some other components, such as brake discs and some fake calipers. They're lug nuts, the rotors are here, the fake calipers are here, but there's no information behind them. There's no axles, there's no spindle, there's no suspension. Because when you look at a render, you're not going to be zoomed in directly on these components. They really are just there as a facade. When we zoom out from the side, you would never be able to tell that there's no brake line, there's no suspension, there's no additional components. They're simply blocked out. It's important from the component aspect of things to include as much as you have to make it look real, but don't spend all your time designing all these components to be 100% realistic when in reality you don't need them in the end. For the car body design, especially when you're doing a concept, you don't need the motor. If it's something that's an open design where you just have an exoskeleton, you would see the motor, you would need to have some sort of representation there. But when you have a standard car body, don't add all that extra detail. It's going to make your assemblies, the rebuild time much higher. It's going to make rotating the components around much higher. And those little things, those small components in the background will end up increasing render times depending on their material settings, if there's any light that's getting through components and so on. When you're talking about a car as a specific example, you could draw a surface that's behind the grill and you could apply a material or an image that looks like a radiator. And that would give you enough of an effect to where you don't need to draw an actual radiator and all the fins and tubes and everything that goes along with that. A real situation where you would have a real radiator would drastically increase those render times because of the number of surfaces and the fact that SOLIDWORKS has to calculate light and reflections and shadows and all that information for those individual surfaces. I also want to talk about your scene. Now, we've talked about some presentation scenes that we have in SOLIDWORKS 2014 and 2015, but you also still have the basic scenes, the empty scenes. And a lot of times, an empty scene can be more realistic than trying to stick your products into a more photorealistic background. For instance, when we're dealing with this car, if we just do a side view and we do a preview window of this in our standard beige 3-point background, this is going to give us a very nice looking render. It looks like it's just in an empty room and it gives us all the information we need to see on the vehicle. We can rotate this around to different angles. For instance, if we wanted a more straight on view, could do another preview of this and take a look at different angles in an empty room environment or a more studio type environment. Because there's no realistic background to this, the reflections are more simple in terms of the actual image that you're seeing reflected on your product, whatever that may be. So you're not looking at the reflection image of clouds and sky and trees and background buildings and all that information. You're looking at lighting effects, maybe a standard single color ceiling with some lighting effects applied to it, or whatever that case might be. The shadows are more simple to actually calculate and create, dealing with a single floor, a single material floor, rather than something that's like a roadway or a curb or grass or leaves or sand or something else besides a standard blank room. And the fact that we don't have that information in the back means that the product, in this case, the vehicle, may look more realistic because we're not trying to have it interact with a scene that it's really not native in. Another thing you'll notice is that even though I have glass here, I have transparency, I have made this a dark tint glass. We can see a little bit of information through here, but because there's no interior, there are no seats, there's not a steering column or a dashboard or any of that information, we don't want the end render to actually look through that. We don't want to see inside because there's nothing there to see. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of less is more is actually the view itself. So if we go ahead and we add a camera, we don't necessarily have to look at the entire vehicle in this case. What we could do is take a very artistic approach to this and take a look at just a portion of the vehicle. So, if we wanted to focus on a certain aspect, for instance, just the side line or really the shape of the side of the car, or maybe the hood line, or maybe one of the fenders or one of the lights, we could do this and when we do this artistic approach, we can use depth of field and we can bring those clipping planes much closer in. For instance, let's go ahead and just say 500 millimeters. We'll zoom this out just a little bit. And what we can do is we can focus on a certain aspect of the car, for instance, the side view mirror here, and then we can bring these clipping planes in closer. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to focus on just a certain aspect of the car, whatever the shape might be that we're interested in. We can take a look at that specific area and leave the rest of this open. And what that'll do is it'll give us a more artistic image. We're not rendering the entire vehicle, all the lighting effects, and all the rest of the information that goes along with it. We're looking at a much smaller aspect of it. In the end, maybe you need a full vehicle render. Maybe you need a actual fly around and looking at a bunch of different angles, and that's fine. But those more artistic approaches, maybe looking at a smaller section, a smaller angle, or sticking it off into the side of the area, or whatever the case might be, a lot of times taking that approach to at least a few renders can give you a much better result.